Our panelists are already lined up, so let's convene today's summit. And as always, before we introduce today's topic, allow me to introduce our distinguished guests from Shenzhen, China. Joining us, Patrick Falk, FSN correspondent there. Here in our Tel Aviv studios, Aluf, Director of Research and Strategy at the Sino Israel Global Network and Academic Leadership, and Reshef, East Asia expert, joining us via Skype. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for joining our show today. So our main topic, it seems no big expectations ahead of the big meeting between the U.S. and China's top diplomats, trying again to play down the potential prospects of any breakthroughs in this respect. But the West is concerned, or risingly concerned, about the rising clout of China. But even if it is somewhat alarming from a Western perspective, should the West try to fight it or just let China be? Let's take a closer look and pick up the debate right after.
Last month, the leaders of the G7 convened in Germany, and whilst a lot of the talk was about the war in Ukraine, one agreement showed their truest worries. They agreed to fund $600 billion in the Partnership for Global Infrastructure to try and provide infrastructure in the developing world. Whilst this plan may seem like major economies being altruistic, there is one major target. China's foreign policy is largely focused on the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, a plan to connect the world through transport over land and sea. This is on the back of China signing deals in the Pacific, increasing its influence in the region. But is this a good thing? Should the West try and rival China, or just let it be? Is it problematic that all these small nations in the Pacific will be dependent on an autocratic regime? Should the West be worried about China's growing influence?
So let's get to it with the most basic yet crucial question. Should the West be worried about China's growing influence? Dear gentlemen, you know the rules. You get 30 seconds to lay out your initial stance, and we pick up the debate right after. So Patrick, please take the lead.
Well, I think a lot of people might debate whether or not China is growing in its influence around the world, particularly given what's happened with the war in Ukraine. I mean, a lot of people might say that China's become increasingly isolated, although it is true to say that it has strengthened its alliances with countries, including Russia, of course, that are certainly opposed to the West, including the U.S.
Definitely, and the impact of the situation in Ukraine obviously is very felt when we're talking about China and its ambitions. Dale, your take?
So I think we need to think about the way that this question is framed. It seems to imply that, you know, we have to look at these things in binary terms, that China's influence is either positive or negative.
Right.
But, you know, we live in a world where countries interact. They don't just impose their will on others. And I think that, to a large degree, whether China's influence is positive or negative largely depends on how countries engage China.
Interesting, and yes, it's not a dichotomy. There's a whole lot in between. We'll get to all of this in a second. Last but not least, Tal, your take?
Yes, I think there are two questions on the stack. One of them is interests. You know, when China is getting more powerful, it gets more aggressive. It hurts the interests of other countries, as we could see. But the bigger problem is that there is a kind of a clash between ways of behaving. Democracy in one hand, authoritarianism on the other hand, international cooperation against the Russian and Chinese conduct. And this is the biggest problem.
So, gentlemen, from this point onwards, please feel free to interact. And I've mentioned this pending meeting between the Chinese and American foreign ministers. Some suggest it will pave the way for a presidential meeting between Xi and Biden. But does it really matter? Maybe there are some topics that cannot be simply talked through. Some things are not up to diplomacy, but actions on the ground. Dale?
Look, most certainly. I'd like to go back a bit and maybe push back against the previous statement that, you know, we're looking at this contest between autocracies and democracies. I don't think it's so black and white. You know, China is certainly not a democracy, and it's authoritarian for sure, but it creates a problem in classification because we have many other countries, that are also autocratic or authoritarian. Some are even democratic, but have a more authoritarian bent. And how do you categorize them? And if you're looking at this from the perspective of the US and its allies, if it wants to engage other countries proactively, if we're going to now put countries into camps, it could actually lead to isolating America and its allies more from these countries.
And we're also seeing Washington changing its tune to an extent when it comes, just an example, Saudi Arabia with a similar record, but again, changing a strategy there. But let's go back to China. Patrick, maybe the U.S. is getting China all wrong, misinterpreting its very core?
Well, I mean, China certainly wants to present that as being the case, and it has said that the US and the West, views it as this sort of imaginary rival. But from all the evidence that we've seen, I mean, certainly, and on the question of liberal democracies versus autocracies, I mean, I think you would have to say that, inevitably, Western liberal democracies are a threat to authoritarian systems like China's.
And Tal, Patrick mentioned earlier the situation in Ukraine. Was the West surprised to an extent by the way China handled the situation? Yes, criticizing Western sanctions on Russia, but still urging perhaps a more peaceful route of action here. Wasn't China risking a potential Russian support if and when things in Taiwan start to gain momentum?
Well, the history of China shows us that this is the Chinese typical behavior, the typical way of conduct, because their approach is, we are China, we act only according to China's interest. The signatures that we left, the contracts and the cooperation, all these are minor. And the interest of China is the only living thing. So, of course, they will be happy to have the support of Russia or other countries, but this is not the main thing. We could see how they ignore their commitment to British rule in Hong Kong when it suited them. It's that just as Russia ignored the signature on respecting the boundaries of Ukraine when they suited them. So we are dealing with another type of countries that are not obliged to the same standards as we are, and therefore we have to take their word and their interest in another way, and we do not see them complying with other nations' interests. In fact, in any case.
So speaking of minding your own business, perhaps on the flip side of it, Dale, we've seen NATO for the first time dubbing China as a threat or an issue even in its priorities, strategic priorities for the coming decade. Is NATO really, getting involved in an unnecessary front?
No, I think that. Excuse me, to whom is it addressed?
No, you can both answer.
Yes, okay. No, I think that China is presently the main threat to NATO. I think that Russia has got to its limit. We could see that the weak Ukrainian army has stopped them very clearly, and now they're gaining some few kilometers. Russia is not a major player. China is a major player, and China is threatening the interest of the NATO countries all around the East Asia, all around the Himalayas with all its importance, all around the Pacific Ocean, and they are sending their influence to the Suez Canal, to Piraeus harbor in Greece.
Yeah, the Road Belt Initiative, obviously. Yes, Dale, your take?
I was just going to say that considering the EU's most recent strategic assessment on China and calling them out as a strategic competitor, that it's not so surprising to see NATO incorporating China into its threat assessment.
And speaking of NATO, or perhaps the NATO influence, in light of this revival or rejuvenation of the alliance in Europe, do you think that the U.S. is perhaps trying to encourage the Quad becoming some sort of Indo-Pacific NATO, Patrick?
It certainly seems as though that's the case, and it would seem to suit the interests of those members as well. I mean, Japan has got various territorial disputes and concerns about China. We've got India with its border disputes with China as well. And of course, we don't need to mention the sort of, worsening of relations between Canberra and Beijing. I mean, there is a possibility for some change now because of the new government in Australia, but it seems as though that is what's being molded.
And again, with Washington constantly assessing and reassessing its policy, it is now trying to expand restrictions on exports to China, perhaps learning some lessons from the case of Russia. Bottom line, trying to develop a strategy that exceeds the border of military or traditional military uses per se into the public sphere, private companies. And my question to you, is it a bit too late? Tal?
Well, it's never too late because history continues. Of course, there have been moments in the past where a tougher approach of Europe, NATO, European community, etc., would have been more necessary than what they did. But of course, the challenges are just in front of us. We need to remember that so far China was acting out of a strength of an emerging superpower, and it is continuing to grow, which means that in a few years their power will be doubled. So this is a preparation for a situation that will be much more crucial than we faced so far, and I'm happy to see that they're handling it in a stricter way.
Dale, how is it being received or perceived in China, those moves?
Look, I think China has pretty much I think China has pretty much accepted that this idea that the US and the West are now seeking to contain China. And we see the Chinese taking lots and lots of steps to mitigate the risks inherent in these kinds of sanctions regimes and export restrictions that America has been imposing on China. I mean, since the trade war began, we've seen that America prevented semiconductor exports to China, which damages China's technological manufacturing sector. And China's response to that has to do with this four-pronged strategy, where essentially they have got their industrial policy made in China 2025 and things like that to help them move up the technological value chain, dual circulation to help them rely more on the internal domestic economy, less on the external economy. The BRI is designed to turn these dependencies on their head. So by exporting these technologies, these countries become dependent on China. And the fourth component is what they call lawfare, which is legal frameworks to protect China against sanctions.
China and private Chinese companies, I assume. In the short seconds we have left to wrap up this part of the debate, Dale, how prevailing is it when it comes to U.S. relations with its allies? We know that it's a recurring topic between the U.S. and Israel, for example.
I think the Americans, until very recently, have been mostly putting out fires, and they haven't had a strategy. It's been very reactive. So I understand how they came to the approach that they came to, which has been take Huawei out of your telecommunication systems. Be careful of doing this cooperation.
Dale, Aluf, Patrick, Falk, Tal, Reshef, if you're staying with us, out for a short break. Continue in a bit. With us, we're staying on topic, obviously, but we have seen Xi's recent visit in Hong Kong. Sending a very clear message to other arenas, perhaps most notably the situation of Taiwan. Let's take a quick listen and pick up the debate right after.
And today, President Yoon and I committed to strengthening our close engagement and work together to take on challenges of regional security, including addressing the threat posed by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, by further strengthening our deterrence posture and working toward a complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, as the President has already spoken to. Promoting stability across the Taiwan Straits as well, and ensuring freedom of navigation, including in the South China Sea and beyond.
So let's get to it, gentlemen, and kickstart this part of the debate with another 30-second round each. We're hearing the rhetoric from the White House getting harsher and harsher. Is the U.S. playing with fire when it comes to threats over the issue of Taiwan? And are the Chinese buying the claims that there is no change in the American policy in this respect? Dale, take the lead, please.
On this one, I'm going to be very brief. I'm not sure exactly what threats you're referring to. Biden has come out and said that America will defend Taiwan, and then the State Department keep walking that back. So I'm not sure if I'd call that playing with fire or even call it threats. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Reshef.
I think that the United States and the Quad and all the other Western powers that were mentioned, they're trying to give a response. Everybody recalls what happened with Adolf Hitler when all the world was trying to appease him, and they're trying not to repeat this mistake. I know that this is a very harsh comparison, but this is true. The behavior of China is ignoring any international commitments, any international cooperation, and exactly like Adolf Hitler, and it has to be taken into consideration.
Interesting. Patrick, your take?
Well, when you say is America playing with fire, I mean, I think it's inevitable that the U.S. has to push back for the sake of its Indo-Pacific policy, a lot of people would say. And in many ways, what it's doing is pushing back simply against China, showing, increasingly giving this sort of show of muscle over Taiwan.
And Patrick and gentlemen, please feel free to interact from this point onwards. Patrick, which side do you think is more inclined, so to speak, to make one step too far?
Well, I mean, it's really hard to say, and you have to imagine that neither side wants to take it a step too far. I mean, it is constantly about pushing those boundaries, you might say, and whereas you've got the US that wants to continue with freedom of navigation exercises, you've got China with increasing incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. I mean, these both carry incredible risks, and the concern is that there is a sort of possible misfire, and then what happens then? But I think, in terms of which side is most likely to make a move first, I think one might argue that neither side really wants to do that.
Yeah, just continue this dangerous tango. But Dale, perhaps the more elementary or basic question once again is the question, how close is China to invade Taiwan?
Look, there's many perspectives on this question, or rather different views on this. I'm of the opinion that it's not going to happen anytime soon. Xi Jinping has a plan. The plan is peaceful reunification. We need to understand, when thinking about China, that China draws on ancient Chinese statecraft like the works of Sun Tzu, and the ideal situation is to win the war without fighting, not to win the war by fighting. Xi Jinping has a lot to lose by invading Taiwan now. Taiwan is not a simple place to invade. It means launching the biggest amphibious invasion probably in history. There's not a lot of beaches for China to be able to land on. Taiwan has turned itself into a porcupine. And I really think that, Xi Jinping is going to exhaust all of his options, and only then will think about going and invading Taiwan. We also have to take into consideration the response from the West and how Xi Jinping has been observing what's been happening with Russia and Ukraine, because, the sanctions on Russia, if they were to happen to China, the situation is very different from the Chinese perspective, because the China's leadership, its contract with its people and its legitimacy is essentially rooted in the party providing economic prosperity for the people. So as soon as something goes wrong there, then the party is in jeopardy, and it's a really big problem.
So, Dale, if I understand correctly, the mere question of what could deter China is redundant, since the Chinese raison d'etre, if you will, is enough to deter it from actually pursuing any moves on the ground until, if and when.
Yeah, until it exhausts its options, they will go to war if they have to, I think, ultimately at the end of the day. But I really don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. And I really don't think that is what Xi Jinping really wants to do right now.
And speaking of the Chinese perception of time, of what is unfolding, Tal Reshef, allow me to take a step back and ask on a broader level. Can America and China escape the infamous Thucydides trap of an emergent power and an existing power, or is this standoff inevitable in a sense?
Yeah. First, I would like to add a few words. I fully agree that invasion of Taiwan will not happen anytime soon unless China is humiliated since they are not invading Taiwan. Only in such a case I see it happening. For the cooperation, international cooperation, we are approaching a situation of not dual powers, but India is also becoming a world power. European Union is also. So the situation is going to be much more difficult. It's a question of building coalitions. America is doing it much better than China so far with the Quad and NATO and other frames. So I do not see them for the moment getting closer to each other to cooperation. I see the world moving into a direction of division into two groups. In one hand, the center will be China and Russia with Mongolia, Laos, Cambodia, and other affiliates. And on the other side, the biggest and much stronger cooperation that we already mentioned.
Fascinating indeed. And Patrick, we're nearing the end of this debate, unfortunately. We spoke last week while President Xi was in Hong Kong. We were talking about his potential bid for a third leadership term. Can he qualify the Hong Kong visit success in this respect?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, as we mentioned last week, it was a victory parade of sorts for Beijing in many ways. But I mean, I think this is also pertinent to the previous question that you asked, and I agree with both others that it doesn't seem as though any attack on Taiwan is imminent. But the only sort of wild card, besides possibly China, being in the position of being humiliated, is that we've also seen with President Xi Jinping that he is eager to leave a legacy of sorts. And, a lot of people would argue that he's been impatient with Hong Kong and couldn't wait until 2047 to impose these drastic changes that we've seen come into play there. The question with Taiwan, I mean, although it seems as though an invasion isn't necessarily imminent, I mean, you wonder how much patience President Xi has, if he does indeed want to leave this legacy, as I say.
Well, I think that perhaps looking at what's happening in the European continent with the lack of patience on behalf of Russian President Putin and perhaps his miscalculations on what is expected to happen on the ground, if anything at all, might have made a potential Taiwan invasion a bit further away. Dear gentlemen, Dale Aluf, Patrick Falk, and Tal Reshef, thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. Hopefully we will see you again on the show. We really appreciate your input. Thank you, gentlemen.